Thank you, Ruth. Good morning, everybody. Well, it was good to have a red book back yesterday. We finally got a budget document which was all about fiscal policy and didn't have fiscal policy as an addendum to a treatise on social engineering from the King of Kirkcaldy. And so there was a step forward there. It was a document that was much more filled with fiscal sense than nonsense. And it's the first time in a long time, I think, we've been able to say that. Did it go far enough? No, I don't think it did. 77% of the cumulative consolidation is on the spending front. Could it have been more than that? Yes, there were low, as TPA pointed out in its budget response, there were low-hanging fruit which could have been cut. But it's certainly better, I think, than maybe some of us expected beforehand. So positive, yes. We would have liked to see other things, reversing the 50% move on the top rate of income tax, putting some sort of long-term target therein for public spending, maybe a desirable ratio of 35% of GDP, maybe by the end of the decade. It slips below TME to GDP, slips below 40% in 2015-16, but it's all a bit tight. And as Williams just said, what happens if there's any sort of bounce back in the future as well? And clearly as well, the fact that the NHS is ring-fenced. We understand the politics of it. Makes no economic sense whatsoever. But that's a political factor which we had to deal with because of the coalition agreement. And there is also an element here that, with Williams' points about the nature of structural reform and how you do it, that this still looks a bit more like salami slicing than actually structural change. But in non-protected budgets, there is a very big cut coming in. And so maybe in the CSR, we can see that process of structural adjustment firmed up. We'll have to see. But it was bold, it was decisive. The Chancellor needed to kitchen sink it. He had a one shot at this one. And I think it was a bold and decisive and a defendable budget as well. It needed to be something as well which didn't damage aggregate demand in the short term and aggregate supply potential output in the long term. And I think on balance, I think it can say that it did do that. It could have done more, but it did do that. Before the budget, we'd said that we'd set out a checklist of successes, key policy measures that were needed in order for the budget to be fiscally successful in terms of not damaging the economy in the short term or the long term. We needed decisive action, not gradualism. We needed faster and deeper spending reductions than financial markets expected, and I think on balance we did get that. We needed the reduction in the deficit focused on public spending, lower spending, not higher taxation. Clearly we didn't get 100% there, but we certainly got most of it. Any increases in taxation, the emphasis had to be on indirect, not direct. And also, the changes in spending needed to be seen as credible and permanent because that could change people's expectations of the future tax burden as well. And I think that was positive. And also it set out a track in certain areas, most obviously in corporation tax, for saying, look, we can't afford the cuts now, but this is a programme of reduction extending over a number of years. That's good as well. Helps build business confidence. It also obviously exploits the opportunity for the tighter we run fiscal policy. Potentially we can very continued low or zero interest rates at the same time as well. And the other key factor that we called for was ring fencing, not NHS, to ring fence the only area of public spending which makes economic sense to ring fence, and that is infrastructure spending on key transport, energy and telecommunications. Not because everything's shovel ready and it'll affect the recovery, no it won't, but because it's positive for long-term growth. Now unfortunately, I think the Chancellor on this front, on this point, gets the Gordon Brown Misrepresentation of Fiscal Policy Award because he talked in the budget document about not cutting any further and having looked at this, and infrastructure was so important that they couldn't threaten it. Yes, the budget goes no further than the March budget under Labour. Unfortunately, the March budget already penciled in a 50% cut in capital expenditure over the next 3 years. So, yes, it doesn't cut it any further, that's a positive, but is it good? Well, not really. It was already meant to halve over the coming years. But I believe it is a defendable budget because it is bold, it is decisive, It's going to come under attack from the Krugmanite, Martin Wolf, Robert Skidelsky worldview that's going to say that, it damages the economy in the short run. I'm sorry, these guys are wrong about fiscal policy in the short run, and they're wrong about the impact of fiscal policy in the long run. I wrote about this last week. Martin Wolf said I was writing drivel. They are going to be very, very bold and very forceful on this, and I'm afraid we have got to be equally bold and forceful, because there's going to be a right old mudslinging battle here, but it has to be fought because it's a right, and we're in the right, and we've got to stick to our guns here. Fiscal policy is not going to throw the economy back into recession. Yesterday was growth positive, it wasn't growth negative. We needed an insurance policy, not because we were in some imminent threat of growing Greek or whatever because of the sovereign debt crisis, but because there is a risk of market speculation there. And the last thing the UK economy needs is higher long-term interest rates. Also, the budget under Brown and Darling perennially overstated trend GDP growth. The OBR now says it's going to fall to 2.1% by 2015-16. I think it's already there. And so the underlying state of the fiscal public finances is worse. We've got all sorts of model uncertainty about fiscal policy at the moment. The OBR is basically assuming a broadly neutral, almost zero fiscal multiplier. But there is a respectable literature, which David alluded to before, showing very strongly that in times of fiscal crisis, you can get negative fiscal multipliers. In other words, less spending can actually mean more growth because of the indirect effects through the private sector and how it changes expectations and risk premia. That is a very powerful force. It's non-linear as well. In other words, the bigger the deficit, the more likely you're going to get these non-Keynesian effects. So we have to stick to our guns here. Tightening policy is the right front. We've done it on expenditure. If you tighten the deficit overwhelmingly through higher taxation, you will create a double-dip recession and you will damage long-term growth. By focusing on the expenditure side, that is good. But we have to get spending under control, because there's what I call the double deficit problem. It's not just the deficit now we've got to close, it's the deficit in the future from the higher cost of an ageing population, debt interest, infrastructure, PFI commitments. We have to get public spending and the size of the state down now, because otherwise we'll lose control of it for a generation. There were some very welcome first steps yesterday, didn't go far enough, but it's the first time in, I think, at least 10 years, I've not wanted to take antidepressants after the budget. Thank you very much indeed.